At the banks of the Tiber River, in the heart of Rome, in the year 1498, the man's name was Niccolò Campi. He printed a poem, just one, 12 lines accusing the Pope of incest with his own daughter. 3 days later, his corpse floated belly up in the moonlight. His tongue was missing. The wound was jagged, torn out by force. A crust of dried blood glued his lips together like a grotesque seal. Fish nibbled at his eyelids. His skin had turned the color of rot green, black, slick with river slime. Rats watched from the quay. They always knew where the meat would come from next. The people found him at dawn. Not one screamed, just silence. A silence that spread like a stain across the cobblestones. No prayers, no burial. The body was dragged off before the sun hit the water, as if Rome itself wanted to forget him. But they remembered what he wrote about her, Lucrezia, and about the Pope Rodrigo Borgia, the man who wore God's crown by day and velvet sheets by night, the man who fathered children in secret, then seated them in thrones of power, the man who smiled as his enemies choked on their final breath. And Cesare, the brother, the shadow, the sword. Some said the poem wasn't just scandal, it was confession, that Niccolò had seen something, heard something, a door left open, a whisper through the walls, the rustle of silk at midnight. What exactly did he know? Who ordered his tongue ripped from his mouth? And why, centuries later, do the rumors still crawl from the crypts of Rome, like worms from a buried plague? This isn't just a story about poison and power. It's about a secret so vile, so forbidden, that the Church would rather erase history itself than speak it aloud. Tonight, you will hear it, and once you do, you won't forget, not even in your dreams. The chapel sits silent, candlelight trembles across frescoed vaults. Rodrigo Borgia kneels at the altar, his breath uneven, his cassock sways in the hush as he whispers a prayer, though his voice lacks conviction. Behind him, a figure moves, drifting into the stained stone shadows, Lucrezia. She is 15, her skin is pale as marble, eyes wide with uncertainty. The hush of prayer becomes a void. A chill drapes the room, heavier than marble. The air smells of incense and something more acrid: fear, sweat, resentment. Cesare stands by the entrance, arms crossed, shoulders rigid. He wears his cardinal's robes, though he has not spoken in Mass for months. Silence suits him. It sharpens his edges like a blade. Lucrezia's fingers twist at the hem of her gown. She can feel every eye in the room, real or imagined, pressing against her like a blade. Her heart pulses in her throat. She catches Rodrigo's shadow cast long against the colonnade. He turns, and for a moment, she sees two faces in his gaze, the Pope and the Father. Moment lingers too long. Rodrigo straightens, his voice echoes. We begin. The word breaks something fragile in Lucrezia, and it cracks her composure. This is life inside the Vatican at the height of power, but power wears a rotten skin beneath the velvet rot that spreads inward, corroding flesh and soul. After Mass, they walk through hallways built of stone that know their guilt. Cesare's footsteps thunder, echoing like a drumbeat of warning. He does not smile. His jaw is set. At the door, he pauses, watching Lucrezia's reflection in polished marble, the curve of her cheek, the tilt of her head. He takes a breath. Something about him cocks, as if tasting the air for betrayal. Lucrezia's pulse thrums in her ears. At 14, she wears her appointments for political marriage with quiet resignation. But inside, she simmers with questions. Why does her father speak of loyalty yet dismiss her tears at night? Why does Cesare linger by her chamber door when others have left? In the evening, a banquet, tapestry adorn the walls, and torches flicker along the stone, platters of fruit, roasted meats, goblets of wine. Laughter drifts across the room, but it feels brittle. Each toast is sharp, each smile hides suspicion. Cesare delivers wine to tables, his step silent. When he passes Lucrezia, their eyes meet. She recoils slightly. He extends a goblet as though offering reconciliation, but his expression chills her. She accepts, trembling. The wine tastes of iron. At midnight, the corridors grow colder. Lucrezia retreats to her chamber above a courtyard drenched in moonlight. She stands by the window, listening, hearing distant bells, the drip of stone fountains, the flutter of curtains. She hears murmured voices in the hush whispers of scandal, laughter that creaks at the edges of fear. She touches the cold pane with a lonely hand. She remembers what she tried to forget: Giovanni Sforza, the broken marriage, the empty contract claimed by her father, 15, traded for alliances, stripped of agency. A rustle at her door. Cesare stands framed in candlelight. His silhouette darkens the threshold. "You heard them," he says softly. "Tell me what they say." Her breath catches. Her lips tremble. She shakes her head. But she knows silence is its own confession. He moves closer. Light pools at his feet. His fingers hover near hers. Pain and longing twist in his gaze. She looks away. Cesare turns back down the hall. His robe swathes him like a coffin. Lucrezia watches him go. In that moment, fear settles deep, fear not of an enemy without, but of the shadow within her family. Night drapes itself thick across Vatican stones. Lucrezia lies in bed, counting the hours until dawn. She feels the weight of history pressing through her ribs. Every breath tastes stale with dread. In the silence, she senses it an emerging pattern: a father who smiles at scandal, a brother who punishes dissent with a glance, a daughter caught in between, tethered by obligation, trembling with untold knowledge. The dawn will come, voices will stir again, but for now, only torches burn, only memory holds secrets, and that is enough to unravel a young life. Rome did not sleep. It murmured, beneath the clatter of horse hooves and the hum of torches. It breathed its secrets into the wind, in back alleys and courtyards, at wine stalls and tailor shops. The whispers grew. They didn't use her full name, not at first. They called her the girl in gold, the Holy Father's jewel, but the stories had teeth, and soon they bared them. Lucrezia's face began to appear in places she'd never been, sketched in black ink on slivers of parchment, passed between market hands like relics of sin. Her lips too full, her eyes too soft. Sometimes she was drawn reclined beside a crowned man with a papal ring, sometimes kneeling in shadow beside a figure in red robes. The images bled suggestion, not proof, but that was enough. In a small wine shop near Campo de Fiori, someone read aloud a poem. "O Father, from the pulpit you cry of heaven, yet from your bed you steal your daughter's breath." Laughter, then a slap, then silence. They knew the risk of laughter in Rome. Behind the Vatican walls, the air grew heavier. Rodrigo read the verses with his wine. Chuckling, artful, he said, "They should write for the stage." He never raised his voice, never called it blasphemy. His ease was more terrifying than outrage. Lucrezia, when she saw one of the sketches handed to her by a trembling maid, said nothing. She folded it in silence. That night, she burned it, watched it twist and blacken. The fire licked the air like a tongue. But inside, something had already scorched her. The palace walls closed in. Servants bowed too deeply. Courtiers smiled too widely. Behind each gesture lay a calculation. Her every step became a performance dress. Posture, tone, each detail, another act of survival. She learned to move like silk, to smile without depth, to listen without blinking. But the questions clung to her skin. Where did the rumors begin? Who watched through the door that should have been locked? Why did Cesare never deny? He only stared, long and quiet, as if the truth were beneath words. Cesare's anger became cold, precise. He summoned a printer to a secluded chamber near the Vatican gardens. The man entered upright. He left with no tongue. His blood spattered the white tiles like spilled ink. That night, the Tiber swallowed him whole. Rodrigo did not comment. He simply lit another candle. The city felt it, a hush beneath the noise. Rome could scream with celebration, but it could also hold its breath with fear. And when it did, every echo sounded like a warning. Lucrezia, meanwhile, prepared for her next marriage. A different dress, a different script. The groom, Alfonso of Aragon, was young, devout, naive. She tried to smile when he offered her a pearl-studded ring, but her hand trembled. Not from nerves, from memory. A memory that would not die. Their wedding feast glittered, wine and gold, music and flesh. Rodrigo sat at the head, radiant and unmoved. Cesare watched from a shadowed alcove, arms folded, lips tight. Lucrezia did not meet his gaze once, but she felt it, like breath at the back of her neck. For a time, the rumors faded. Alfonso's love was genuine. He touched her with care. He listened when she spoke. He treated her like a woman, not a piece on a chessboard. And for the first time in years, Lucrezia dreamed without waking in terror. But peace in Rome is like spring and plague season, beautiful, doomed, and always too brief. A letter arrived in Cesare's hand. Naples had shifted, alliances cracked. Alfonso's value plummeted like rotten fruit. Rodrigo shrugged. It is unfortunate. Cesare said nothing, but his eyes held the shape of a decision. One night, footsteps followed Alfonso through a narrow street near Trastevere. 3 men, faces masked, blades glinting. He cried for help. None came. They left him bleeding, half dead. Lucrezia found him days later, bandaged and pale, breath shallow. She wept beside him, clutching his hand. "Who did this?" she whispered. He didn't answer, but in his gaze lived the knowledge. Cesare had been there. 2 weeks later, Alfonso choked to death in his chambers. A man was seen leaving with red on his sleeves. Lucrezia screamed until her voice broke. That night, in her chamber, she smashed the mirror. Glass everywhere, blood at her fingertips. A piece remained lodged in her palm. And even as the pain blinded her, she did not call for help. She knew what would happen next. Rome would return to whispers. And this time, they would be louder. The summer air in Rome had turned thick, swollen with heat. And something else. Dread. It clung to the marble like damp wool in the palace corridors. Even the torches flickered low. Reluctant to speak, servants moved quieter. Doors closed faster. And in the heart of it all, Lucrezia sat beside her husband's bed, pressing a damp cloth to his fevered brow. Alfonso of Aragon was dying, and everyone knew it except perhaps Alfonso himself. His chest rose in short, shallow breaths. Purple bruises still shadowed his ribs, gifts from the attack weeks earlier. He tried to speak, but each word came out like a cough smothered in blood. Lucrezia whispered to him, gently, brushing curls from his forehead. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. She knew who had done this. Not the masked figures in the alley, but the shadow who now avoided her gaze in every hallway. Cesare. He had not spoken to her in days, had not looked her in the eye since that night, the night Alfonso was dragged home, broken and silent, like a message carved in flesh. Cesare had smiled once, briefly, when told Alfonso lived. Not because he was pleased, because it meant he had failed. Lucrezia stayed with Alfonso through the nights. She ignored the whispers outside her door. She prayed, not to saints, but to the memory of the girl she used to be, the girl who believed in love, who thought she could outrun her name. But the palace would not let her forget. On the 3rd night, Alfonso awoke, eyes wide with fear. "They're coming," he gasped. I saw him. His hand clutched hers, weak and clammy. "Your brother." She froze. He tried to rise, panic surging, but his body betrayed him. She held him close. "No one will hurt you," she whispered. "Not while I'm here." But even she didn't believe it. That morning, she begged Rodrigo to protect her husband. He listened. Sipping wine. "My dear," he said softly, "if he dies, it will not be your fault." Then he rose. The matter, to him, was closed. The hours passed slowly. That evening, the air in the hallway shifted as if the palace itself had taken a breath. Cesare entered the chamber alone. Lucrezia was not there. The nurse had been dismissed by a vague command. No one saw who gave it. Inside, Alfonso lay awake, watching the door. Cesare stepped forward, no hesitation, no words. He sat at the edge of the bed, his hand resting on the hilt of a dagger. The room was quiet, too quiet. Alfonso opened his mouth, but Cesare pressed 2 fingers to his lips. Then slowly, gently, with almost affectionate precision. His hands moved to Alfonso's throat. Outside, a candle flickered. Inside, there was only the sound of breath, then struggle, then silence. Lucrezia returned moments later. Cesare was already gone. The nurse screamed. Lucrezia didn't. She stood over Alfonso's body, frozen. Her eyes traced the bruises blooming on his neck. She reached out to close his eyes, but her hands would not move. She had always known this would happen. Later, Cesare appeared at the top of the stairs, his face unreadable. Their eyes met. He didn't flinch. She didn't blink. The silence between them was absolute, louder than any scream. From that day, something in Lucrezia broke. She stopped wearing color. Her laughter, once soft and rare, disappeared entirely. Her eyes, always luminous, grew darker not in shade, but in depth. People said she had grown into a woman. They were wrong. She had grown into a ghost. The palace continued around her. Parties, councils, intrigue. But Lucrezia moved through it all like a figure painted in oil, untouchable, suspended, always watching. And Rome whispered louder than ever. This time, not just about a pope and his daughter, but about a woman who watched her brother murder her husband and said nothing. Because what could she say? No one in Rome believed in innocence. Not anymore. The dining hall shimmered with gold and danger. Crystal goblets lined the long table, catching firelight and splitting it into fragments. Musicians played a slow, lilting air, plates steamed with roasted game, honeyed figs, and blood-red oranges. Everything was beautiful. Everything was a warning, as the Borgia feast had begun. Rodrigo sat at the head of the table, wearing crimson robes heavy with embroidery. He laughed loudly, lips stained dark with wine. Around him, cardinals in silk robes murmured blessings and drank with shaking hands. Ambassadors from Spain, France, and Naples lifted goblets in uneasy unison. No one touched the fruit first. Lucrezia arrived late. She moved like smoke, dressed in black, lips pale, her gaze skimming the faces with cold detachment. She took her place beside her father, folding her hands in her lap. Her glass remained empty. Cesare arrived last. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. He walked the line of the table, greeting men he might later bury. When he leaned in to speak to the French envoy, the man flinched. Cesare whispered something no one heard what, and then raised his own glass. For a moment, all was still. Then came the first cough. A cardinal near the center of the table jerked suddenly, wine spilling from his lips. His eyes rolled upward. His hands clawed the air. Seconds later, a second man gasped and collapsed against the floor. Cutlery clattered. The music stopped. Rodrigo didn't move. He reached calmly for a fig and bit into it. The guests panicked. Chairs toppled. One man vomited blood onto the silk rug. A servant screamed. Another guest collapsed face first into his stew. Cesare stood unmoved, watching eyes sharp, cold, calculating. He looked not at the dying, but at the survivors. He was measuring them. Lucrezia did not blink. She watched her wineglass, untouched, as if expecting it to crack in her hand. Within minutes, 5 men were dead. Poison, someone whispered. Cantarella. A poison that did not stain the cup, that left no color, no taste, no smell, only silence. Servants rushed to remove the bodies. The guests were ushered out with apologies and blessings. No questions asked, no answers expected. By dawn, no official record of the deaths remained. But Rome knew. It always knew. In the markets and brothels, the story spread, the Borgia feast. The poison supper became a legend before the blood had dried. They said Cesare kept a vial beneath his belt, warmed by his own skin, that he tasted every drop before it was served, except to those he marked. They said Lucrezia carried a ring that opened to release a single droplet of death into a chalice, that her smile was a prelude to burial. The stories varied. The fear did not. Inside the palace, silence grew thicker. Rodrigo's laughter faded. His face grew pale. He began to see shadows where none stood. He whispered to statues. He blessed empty rooms. At night, he prayed longer not to God, but to his own reflection. Lucrezia stopped attending the feasts. She wrote letters instead, pages that burned with ink but held no words of the heart, only strategy, only calculation. She had learned well. One night, she found Cesare alone in the garden. He was kneeling beside a marble angel, staring into its hollow eyes. He did not look up as she approached. "You shouldn't have done it," she said. His reply came slowly. They weren't loyal. They were human, she whispered. He turned his face to her. For the first time in years, he looked young again, not cruel, not invincible, just tired. "I had to," he said. She didn't answer. She knelt beside him, her skirt brushing stone. Their shoulders touched. Neither moved. The angel watched in silence. By morning, another name was gone from the ledger of the Vatican. Another man buried in secret. Another silence written in the blood of those who had spoken too freely. And above them all, Rome watched and waited. The doors to the papal chamber did not creak. They groaned, like ancient trees bearing too much fruit, too much sin. Behind them, the world turned sideways. The man who ruled Christendom reclined with a woman in his lap. Her name was Giulia Farnese. She was called La Bella, the beautiful one. Golden curls spilled down her shoulders like melted sun. Her skin glowed with oil and satin. Her laughter was low, deliberate, a sound not meant for churches. Rodrigo Borgia ran his fingers through her hair as though combing through grace. He was still in his robes. His ring, the fisherman's ring, glinted as it traced her jaw. Outside, the bells tolled vespers. Inside, the Pope kissed his mistress. No curtain was drawn. A servant entered with a tray. He did not look. He did not speak. He set the tray down and left, as he always did, eyes on the floor. Giulia smiled and nibbled a fig. "Don't you fear judgment?" she asked, brushing juice from her lip. Rodrigo chuckled. "Judgment fears me." He meant it. In the Vatican gardens, Vanozza de Catane, Lucrezia's mother paced alone beneath the cypress trees. She had once been Rodrigo's only one. She bore him children, 3 of them, and for a time she believed in permanence. Now she was little more than a relic, whispered about, nodded to, rarely invited. She carried her pride like a blade sheathed in silk. Lucrezia saw her only in glances across balconies, behind veils. Vanozza's mouth always tight, her eyes unreadable. A woman cast out by the man who wore God's crown. The Vatican knew, everyone knew, and yet Rodrigo made no attempt to hide his desires. He summoned women openly, danced with them during festivals, kept their portraits hung in his private quarters. Once, he hosted a masquerade where cardinals came dressed as devils and Giulia as the Virgin Mary. When questioned, he laughed. "We are all flesh before we are spirit," he said. Rome did not forget. Lucrezia, walking the stone halls, began to hear the laughter behind her grow sharper, not only about her, but about her father, about what the church had become, a palace of appetites. A man once approached her in a corridor, pale, drunk, breathing wine and contempt. He leaned in close and whispered, "Does your father confess? Before or after?" She did not answer. Cesare found the man 3 days later, hanging upside down from a scaffold, his mouth sewn shut with wire. Rats had begun to chew the soles of his feet. Lucrezia visited the chapel that evening, not to pray, to breathe, to remember quiet. She lit a candle, but the flame sputtered. The wax melted crooked. She watched it, unmoving. Then she spoke aloud, not a prayer, but a question. "Who are we now?" The word echoed. Who? In the days that followed, she took to riding alone, beyond the palace walls, through narrow streets where no titles followed. She wore plain robes, spoke little, and yet, even there, people stared, children whispered, women crossed themselves. She had become an icon, not of holiness, of something darker. Lucrezia once saw a girl no older than 10 sketching on parchment by a fountain. She approached silently. Over the girl's shoulder, she saw the drawing a woman in a crown, flanked by 2 men, one in armor, one in robes. Between them, a bed. The girl looked up, startled. Lucrezia only said, "Is that your story?" The girl nodded. My father says it's true. Lucrezia walked away without a word, but her breath did not come easy for hours after. Back in the palace, Rodrigo aged swiftly. His hands, once steady with ink and indulgence, now trembled. He coughed through the nights. His skin yellowed. Even Julia came less often. He called for Lucrezia. She sat beside him, holding his hand. I have sinned, he whispered once. She said nothing. I did it for power, for you, for him, for all of us. Still, she said nothing, because words no longer held meaning here. What could she say to a man who wore the keys of St. Peter on his chest while his lips tasted ruin? In his last months, Rodrigo ordered new portraits. In one, he posed with Julia and Cesare. His hands rested on both. Lucrezia refused to sit. When asked why, she replied, I've already been painted in stories I never agreed to. At night, she dreamt of fire. Not hellfire, but something quieter. A slow burn. A candle too close to parchment. A palace devoured not by judgment, but by the weight of its own hunger. She woke often, and the Vatican walls never felt colder. The heat that summer did not feel natural. It pressed against the stone walls of the Vatican like judgment, like breath on the neck. Rome smelled of citrus and sweat, and something darker, the scent of a city waiting for a crown to fall. Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, had grown hollow. His robes hung looser, his voice rasped. He coughed more, laughed less. The feasts grew fewer, the invitations, selective, behind closed doors. Apothecaries came and went, so did whispers. They said he had been poisoned. They said it was cantarella. They said it was his own. One night, after a banquet laced with too much wine and not enough prayer, he collapsed. His face went slack, his skin turned gray, for 3 days. He lay in bed, sweating, moaning, muttering in Latin and Spanish, and sometimes names of the dead. Lucrezia watched from the doorway. She did not enter. Her hands clenched the frame like it might shatter under her grip. Cesare stood at the foot of the bed. Unmoving, he watched their father die. Slowly, quietly, the breath left him with a sound like parchment torn. No one cried. The papal apartment was cleared, curtains drawn, portraits covered, priests summoned, not for mourning, but for inventory. The Holy Father was now a body, one that must be recorded, relocated, replaced. Lucrezia entered the chamber after they had gone. It still smelled of incense and bile. She walked to the table where his rings had been laid. She touched none of them. She only looked at the cloth that covered his face. A wrinkle in the linen caught her attention, a fold that rose like a brow, as if he were still thinking beneath it. Behind her, Cesare's boots echoed. He's gone, he said. She didn't answer. He stepped closer. We have to move quickly. Still, she said nothing. Finally, he touched her shoulder. That was when she turned. Her eyes were no longer wet. They were stone. You killed him, she said. It was an accusation. It was a statement. Cesare blinked once. I didn't. Lucrezia stared for a moment longer. Then she turned back toward the window. Whether he had or hadn't no longer mattered. Rome believed it. That was enough. The days that followed were chaos dressed in silk. Cardinals jostled for favor. Cities changed flags. Enemies circled. Allies disappeared. Cesare tried to hold it together through blood, through threats, through promises. He rode out with mercenaries, claimed towns, enforced oaths, but without Rodrigo's shadow behind him, his blade dulled. He returned to Rome thinner, quieter. Then one morning, he too was gone. News came weeks later. A skirmish in Navarre, a fall, a wound too deep, a helmet shattered, a body trampled in the mud. Cesare Borgia died not with a scream, but with silence. His enemies celebrated. His soldiers drank. Lucrezia lit no candle. She was already gone. Ferrara welcomed her not with suspicion, but with curiosity, a city hungry for music, for art, for legacy, and she gave it to them. She became duchess. She became patroness. She became mother. In time, they forgot her name had once been Borgia. But she never forgot. In her chambers, she kept a small chest. Inside a ring she never wore, a lock of blonde hair, a folded parchment too faded to read. She opened it once a year, never more. At night, she walked her gardens alone. The moonlight cast her in silver. The wind caught her gown like wings. She looked like a woman risen from her own grave. They called her wise. They called her gentle. They never called her haunted. But she was, because the ghosts she carried did not scream. They whispered, like the ones in Rome. And sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she could still feel the candlelight from her father's chamber, could still taste the metallic air of that poisoned feast, could still hear Cesare's voice low, certain, final. And in those moments, the Duchess disappeared. And the girl, the one who once stood between a father and a brother and 1,000 rumors sharpened like knives, returned. Silently, unseen, unforgiven. Years passed. The Vatican rebuilt itself, brick by brick, prayer by prayer, as if history could be erased by silence. New popes wore the same robes. New cardinals walked the same marbled halls. But the shadows they remembered. In Ferrara, Lucrezia aged slowly. The lines around her eyes deepened not from laughter, but from holding too much back. She sat for portraits now still, composed, her hands folded over silk. The artists always asked her to smile. She never did. At court, she was admired her poise, her intelligence, her grace under impossible weight. Children bowed to her, nobles consulted her, poets praised her name in verses thick with longing. And yet, when she walked alone at dusk, no one ever dared follow. Because even in her silence, there was danger. In a hidden room in her estate, she kept a small altar, not to saints, not to martyrs, but to memory, a locket, a page torn from a book, a letter she had written and never sent. And sometimes, when the wind rose outside her window, she would light a single candle and whisper the names no one else was allowed to speak. Rodrigo, Cesare, Alfonso. The wax would melt, the flame would flicker, and the dead would stay dead, but not forgotten. She died quietly. No screams, no poison, no scandal. Just breath, then none. They buried her beneath Ferrara's chapel.
The wax
stone
would melt,
sealed her in like
the flame
a
would
secret.
flicker,
Bells
the dead
rang,
would stay dead,
mourners wept,
but not
and
forgotten.
the city moved
She
on.
died quietly.
But Rome
No
did
screams,
not.
no poison,
Rome, with its broken
no scandal,
statues and blood-soaked stones,
just breath,
still
and none.
speaks her name, not in
They buried her
prayers,
beneath
but
Farah's
in
chapel.
rumors.
The stones
They
sealed
say she
her in
drank
like a
from the
secret.
same cup as the men she
Bells
buried,
rang, mourners
that
wept,
she loved her
and the
brother
city moved
as
on.
no sister should,
But Rome did not.
that her father crowned her with a
Rome,
kiss.
with its broken
No
statues
court
and
ever
blood-soaked
proved it.
stones,
No
still
scroll
speaks
ever
her
confirmed
name.
it.
Not
But
in
the
prayers,
whispers remain
but
old
in
as
rumors,
marble, sharp as
that her
glass,
father crowned her with a
soft as
kiss.
ash.
No
And when you
court
walk
ever
the Tiber
proved
at
it.
night,
No
beneath
scroll
the
ever
flickering
confirmed it.
torchlight,
But the
if
whispers
you listen
remain.
closely, if you let
And
the
when you walk
silence
the
breathe,
Tiber at night,
you might
beneath
still
the
hear
flicker,
her.
you might still hear her.
And she does not deny,
And she does not
she does
deny,
not defend,
she does not
she only
defend.
waits.